And so I think we're going to pivot now to the modern church, Dan.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
more, so me, I'm more like, I don't really go to these mega churches. I do my smaller Sabbath meetings. Dan, as he said previously, works for a church. Dan, just lay it out for us. Like, what are some of these other additional, Pharisaical laws that the church adds onto it?
For sure. And look, before I get into that, I want to say I'm not attacking the church. I think the church has got the right motive, but I'm kind of making an argument that I think the Pharisees did too. I don't think the
Absolutely.
motive is bad. I think we're just sort of accidentally finding ourselves to be modern day Pharisees. So some of the examples I can point to, like some low hanging fruit, especially if you come from like a Southern Baptist background, you might have heard things like you can't watch rated R movies, or you can't drink any kind of alcohol, or if you don't dress like us, you don't belong. None of those things are laid out in the law of God. Nowhere does it say you cannot watch a rated R movie because there's cuss words. Nowhere does it say you cannot have any drinks. Jesus's first miracle was turning water into wine at the request of his own mother. It does say to have modest dress, but who's to say what modest dress actually means? And I think where it becomes pharisaical is when you go, if you don't wear your skirt down to your feet, that's not modest. Therefore, you actually don't belong to us. Now, the argument that people are going to make there is they're going to say the reason we put these things in place is to prevent sin to begin with. So my question for you, Michael, is if they're saying don't watch a rated R movie, don't drink alcohol, don't wear, a skirt unless it's all the way down to your ankles or whatever the addition, or wash your hands before you eat a thing. This is really there to help prevent sin. Why is this actually an issue in your view?
Well, before I get on that, again, I want to reiterate myself that we're not attacking. I've been a Pharisee in my life. I'm sure Dan has as well. You started getting into this walk. You start creating your own doctrines, right? And then you have to check yourself and be like, whoa, 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 okay, this is not. Maybe I'm too judgmental. Maybe I don't. I can do this or I can't do this. Kind of thing. Um, but as far as, I think and also I want to say this kind of just hit me as he was talking. It's not just an outwardly thing. So it's not just dirty works. It's not just jeans and movies and alcohol. I want to say it's doctrine too. Like if you don't believe the same way I do and I condemn you to hell, that's a Pharisee. That's a Pharisee.
Yeah.
You are not in that judgment seat as well. And I see that a lot in my walk is more of a doctrine. Like if you don't agree with a certain doctrine, get out kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Well, one of the more like sneaky ways I see it, man, for like modern day Pharisees are adding to the law, and this is very, very sneaky, but particular in the modern Western church or the mega church, however you want to call it, is what I would say you see it in the discipleship ministries. And what I mean by that is a lot of the terminology you'll get is your next step of faith. So let's say you're a new believer, you raise your hand, you go, I believe in Jesus for the very first time. It moved me, and I'm going to accept the free gift of salvation for the first time. That's praise God. That's good stuff. But what the church will do is go, cool. Now that you've experienced salvation, your next step of obedience is to join a community group or to go on a mission trip or to hold the door open on Sunday mornings by serving at the church. And look, these things aren't bad things.
nope.
I think the heart is good. And I would even go as far as saying they're basing that on the Great Commission. And look, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Bible or you're new to Bible study, the Great Commission is the game plan of Jesus that he has for the church. So it's the marching orders. In Matthew 28, Jesus says, therefore, go and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And in verse 20, it says, and this is really key, it says, teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you, for I am with you. Well, that part, that second part of the Great Commission, teach them to obey all that I've commanded you. The church has gone so heavy on mercy and grace and that's not works based, and it's like a total panic attack to make sure the church does not think they earn salvation. So much so that they've cornered themselves in teaching to be obedient to the commandments of God.
Right.
So because we're not teaching the importance of keeping the commandments of God and how it's directly related and directly linked to how we know him, as in
And
First
love
John
them.
chapter 2, verse 3, and love him as in John chapter 14, excuse me. if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Because we're not teaching that in the church, what happens is we go, well, we get the whole baptizing thing. That screams out mercy and grace. You know, you don't do anything. You don't bring anything to the table. You just profess Jesus, you baptize in his name. That's full grace. But then that second part of the Great Commission, teach them to obey all that I've commanded you. I don't know what to do with that, because I'm sitting here teaching, don't. It's Pharisaical. You're a Pharisee if you
Right.
if you keep the commandments of God. What I'm hoping and we're hoping to do here on Bromalogy is tear down that nonsense, that is not true. That keeping the commandments of God is actually how we know that we know him, and it's how we love
Right.
him according to his word.
And
Go
Dan
ahead,
and I,
Mike.
I was just going to say, Dan and I, we've had side discussions where, like, obedience is basic. Like, it should be. It should be just like, here, just do these small things. It's not a burden, right? That's something a child can do, and that's how he said to come to him too, right? Jesus says, "Come to me like a child." Dan's a father. Dan just tells his son, "Do these things." He just does it because he trusts him. Where we're going to get maturity coming from milk to meat, or bromology here, is the heart, the why behind it. That's the harder thing, right? I can't just go to Walmart and buy patience, right? That's a gift given to me. And Dan, if you don't mind, I want to talk about more of a Pharisaical heart with Mary Magdalene, unless you have anything to add there.
Yeah, for sure. The last thing I would add
Yeah.
before we get into Mary, because that's fantastic, and that actually opens up a whole new beer for a whole new bar in the light and of not being Pharisaical. It's okay to drink a beer, by the way. Um, what the church is doing, I think, incidentally, which is what the Pharisees were doing, was trying to prevent sin, or trying to figure out a way to do the right thing to make
Right.
disciples that make disciples. They abandoned teaching that you should keep the commandments of God, and you yourself should do it. So not only should you be obedient to the commandments of God, but you should teach others to do the same. That's what Jesus says in Matthew 5 to do. What they do is they replace the commandments of God with organizational goals. And I know that hurts. I know that one stings, but that's what happens. Instead of teaching that you should keep the Sabbath, remember it, we teach join a disciple group, join a community group. Now, joining a community group is not a bad thing. It's just simply not a commandment of God. Go on a mission trip. That's your next step of faith. That's your next obedient step. Well, listen, going on a mission trip's not a bad thing. It's just simply not a commandment of God. You should hold the
And
door open at church. Is
and
that a
Bib-
bad thing? No, it's not a bad thing. It's just simply not a commandment of God. And so the church they put themselves in that pigeonhole by saying you're a Pharisee if you try to keep the commandments of God. They have no choice but to go, well, what do we do with the second part of the Great Commission where Jesus says, teach them to do that? I don't know. Let's just give them some organizational goals. And then that'll be what we do to tell them to take next steps of obedience. Does that make sense what I'm saying here?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think when you say you get rid of the commandments of God, it's wild, wild west. And then even the church has to be like looking like, whoa, what did we do? Let's start creating these boundaries, these fences around the law, like you just explained. Because they, in their innate sense of their soul, they're like, whoa, what happened? So maybe it's almost like they're creating their own laws to kind of
Mm-hmm.
get us back to what they should have been
For
doing in the
sure. And I
bill.
think
And
we get confused about,
yeah,
Jesus is the one, right, in Matthew 28 saying, teach them to obey all that I have commanded you. Well, we go, the Old Testament, Yahweh. That isn't Jesus. Well, according to the New Testament letter of Jude, which we've covered here at Bromalogy, I want to say it's verse 5. I might be wrong, but it says that Jesus was the one that handed the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. So that means that Jesus, when he says, teach them to obey all that I have commanded you, it includes, but not limited to, the 10 commandments.
yeah. And you said about mission trip too. I was thinking of Paul too. And you said that was the first thing to do. And I'm like, well, Paul waited 3 years before he went on a mission. He went back and studied, so maybe, that's not the first thing
Well,
to
this
do.
is where we're getting at a bromology, right? Like you've made the point before, and I tend to agree, and it took me a minute to come around to this, but that the milky stuff moved from, Paul's like, I can't believe you guys haven't moved from milk to meat. The milky stuff is this basic, it's following the commandments of God. Those are the basics, right? The meat is really the internal stuff. It's the
Right.
fruit of the spirit. So that's, I mean, listen, man, this sounds really bad. And again, I'm not attacking the church,
We've all
but
been
I don't
milky.
I don't even know that we're teaching. I don't even know that we're feeding people with milk.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what we're feeding them with, but it's definitely not meat. But I don't even think we're teaching them milk.
And that's why people are starving. You work at a church, people ask you questions all the time. It's because they're starving for that milk. They're not even getting milk. They're not even getting fed. Like you said,